I've had the idea of exploring an author's body of work for the past 2 years now, wanting to enjoy an author once again, one that I've read many times before, possibly even one that I've read all the works of, so that I can further examine their body of work. Initially, I had wanted to choose an author whose work I've read all of, but I thought it would be best to pick an author whose works don't do much for me. You see, I used to be a fan of this author a long time ago, back when I was in college, a much younger man. However, times have changed. As the inspiration for this series is one of exploration, I also thought it would be good to choose an author who is a science fiction author. And that's why I knew that this first in the series had to be none other than Kurt Vonnegut. Who can forget when Billy Pilgrim became unstuck in time, or when Bokanon's last wish was to thumb his nose at God? That said, please do not remind me of Kilgore Trout. You see, I find in Kurt Vonnegut's work that there is an air of self-importance, of arrogance even. I'm only going to cover his fiction. I've already read his nonfiction to learn a lot about him, and I've also read his short stories before, but I don't want to add more trauma to my life. 14 novels is enough, I think. Hopefully, through exploring all of these novels, I will find something of them. With all of that said, it's time to ask ourselves, who is Kurt Vonnegut? Kurt Vonnegut was born to a German-American family on November 11th, 1922, in Indianapolis, Indiana. His father worked as an architect. They'd take trips to Europe and Cape Cod. Unfortunately for Kurt Vonnegut Jr., this would not last long. The Great Depression happened and devastated his family. Not only did it devastate them and set them back financially, but also emotionally. It had a great impact on his mother's mental health. There were other problems within the family as well. Kurt Jr. really wanted the attention of his parents, but found it very difficult. As a teenager, he listened to a radio program, Vic and Slade. Through this, he learned the power of comedy and how he could garner the attention that he so desperately craved. Kurt learned how to amuse his parents, often telling jokes. One other element of Kurt's stories that might ring true throughout all of his work comes from the sense of humor that was very popular in his family, which was a sense of Schadenfreude, a German word that means taking pleasure in the pain of others. That's not to say Kurt grew up with much of a influence from his German heritage, because after World War I, German culture was frowned upon in America and looked down upon, so he never learned German, and he wasn't shown much of his other German heritage. He had a sister who he greatly admired and often wrote for as he grew up. He had a brother as well, and he was the favorite. He was excellent in the sciences. Kurt began his writing career for The Echo in high school. While he was still in high school, his father and brother convinced him to study the sciences, eventually choosing chemistry when he went to Cornell. The reason for this is that his father said be anything but an architect. When he went to Cornell, he continued writing, this time for the college newspaper, The Sun. His pacifist beliefs ring true all the way through his early years, as he was part of a Republican family at the time, and they wanted an isolationist approach to the German Reich. Having never been a strong student, he eventually decided to drop out and enlist so that he was not drafted into the military to fight in World War II. A shocking turn of events in the year 1944, on Mother's Day, Kurt's mother took her own life. Kurt had been sent to Europe after the invasion of Normandy and was later captured as a prisoner of war and sent to Dresden, where he witnessed the firebombing. After having gone missing in action for 6 months, he was sent to Kansas to write-up discharges. Later, using the GI Bill, he attended the University of Chicago, married a woman named Jane, and continued to be a terrible student there as well. When he studied anthropology. After a handful of years, and after having his first son Mark, named after Mark Twain, his favorite author, he eventually dropped out, once again not getting a degree. He was not out of luck, though, as he was hired by General Electric, where his brother was working for the past few years. However, he felt very stifled by the work that he was doing, thought it was akin to fiction, which is why he started writing his own short stories. Eventually, he wrote his own novel, and that manuscript was finished at the end of November 1951 and published the next year as Player Piano. Due to the concepts and themes in this novel, he was considered a science fiction author, as he looked at a dystopian future full of automated machines. He would, throughout his career, become well known for his satirical novels, often using science fiction tropes, and use postmodern techniques in his writing to highlight and exemplify the horrors and ironies of the 20th century. He didn't always appreciate having been considered a science fiction author, having once said, "I have been a sore-headed occupant of a file drawer labeled science fiction ever since Player Piano, and I would like out since so many serious critics regularly mistake the drawer for a tall white fixture in a comfort station." According to the biography And So It Goes, this belief that serious critics, or the literati, would continue throughout his life. Eventually, Player Piano went out of print, and it would take 7 more years before he would publish another novel. He began writing more short stories and plays to try to make up some money. He did accept an advance for the second novel that he would publish. The year before his second novel came out, his sister died of breast cancer. She died a day after her husband fell to his death in a train accident. So Kurt and his wife adopted their sons. In 1959, The Sirens of Titan finally released. It sold miserably. Though it was nominated for the best novel. It really starts to show some of the techniques that he would use that would come throughout the rest of his career, including shorter novels, rapid characterization. The next year, he began writing Mother Night, which at the time he was calling Evil Anyone. It's about a 200-page novel, more or less, with 45 chapters. It also sold poorly. The success, or lack thereof, that Kurt was dealing with in his writing career, as much as he wanted that admiration and adulation, was lacking and causing marital strife. See, him and his wife were a sort of partnership. She dealt with the kids and the household work, and he was a grouchy man. If you read And So It Goes, you will see a very dark portrayal of Kurt, especially in his family life. For Kurt's next novel, he worked on an idea that he got from a visit that H.G. Wells had at General Electric when he was looking at Irving Langmuir's ideas about an isotope of water that can freeze at room temperature. However, H.G. Wells never used the idea. Kurt gladly stole this, explored this concept in Cat's Cradle. It was a success. Coincidentally, he also used it as a thesis for his master's. It's a cynical satire full of dark jokes and blasphemous ideas, also full of the anxieties of the Cold War with a life-ending weapon, Ice Nine. While Kurt was in the war, he made a really good friend, Bernard V. O'Hare. After 1963, when Cat's Cradle was published, he had been working on his war novel. It took him a long time to work on this. It was always in the back seat of his mind. On a trip to see his friend, Bernard's wife once said, "You were just babies in the war. You'll pretend you were men instead of babies, and you'll be played in the movies by Frank Sinatra and John Wayne or some of those other glamorous, war-loving, dirty old men, and war will look just wonderful, so we'll have a lot more of them." This conversation, as well as some other influences, which I will get to in my video on Slaughterhouse-Five, really opened up his eyes for how to tell the story. A few years later, in 1965, he started to teach as a writer-in-residence at the Iowa Writers' Workshop, the most famous writing workshop in the entire country. He had recently published God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, which is the first occurrence in the novel of Kilgore Trout. Kilgore Trout is inspired by a brief meeting of Theodore Sturgeon, who was trying to show off and doing some kind of acrobatic activity at his house, according to And So It Goes. He made a fool of himself and fell down. He also started having a number of affairs at this time. During his time at Iowa, he met a very important person in his life, Sam Lawrence. Offered $75,000 for what would eventually be Slaughterhouse-Five and 2 more novels. This partnership invigorated Kurt's career. Hollywood wanted rights to his stories. The New Yorker wanted a story of their own. The New York Review of Books dedicated 2 whole pages to him. Foreign editors wanted to translate him. And after 2 years, on the day exactly, he left Iowa. Although he was very cynical and a tough critic, particularly of capitalism and the way it doesn't work for everybody, he had a number of contradictions. In some of his books, he criticizes, for example, mining companies and the damage that they do. Meanwhile, he's invested in them. Liberals. As his career developed, he liked putting himself and more autobiographical elements into his novels more and more. Of course, he was releasing nonfiction every so often, but he wanted to have self-insert with Kilgore Trout, wanted these introductions to explain his thoughts and these ideas, and we can see life events of his own, even in his earlier novels. As time goes on, they become more and more personal. Because he's putting himself so much into these novels, fans of his, particularly college readers, and he would be on a speaking circuit, and people would love to see him, and they had this image that he was just like Elliot Rosewater, or perhaps Kilgore Trout, or even Billy Pilgrim. This is not who Kurt Vonnegut was in his real life. So he tried to put on an affected character as he went on and was meeting people. But the cracks were slipping. This is something very similar to what Mark Twain would do. So eventually he did stop going on speaking tours for a while. On his 50th birthday, he finished his next novel, Breakfast of Champions, which is when his career in terms of writing starts dwindling. The reviews start going down, and the attacks start to feel more personal, because remember, he's putting himself more into these books. He's really put himself deep into it. Some critics even went so far as to say his best work was behind him. Kurt, of course, thought that this was the critics picking on him. When he stopped going on the speaking circuit, he divorced his wife Jane, married another woman who he had been living with for the past 9 years. Her name is Jill. By 1980, he had his last child with Jill. He had started working on Jailbird once he stopped doing the speaking tours, and in 1980, he also published a second nonfiction piece, Palm Sunday, was not reviewed well. One of the critics made the comment that Kurt only writes for immature readers. Jailbird was published 2 years later. Dead-Eyed It, a very, very autobiographical story dealing with an elderly man that feels that most of his life has passed him by. David R. Slavitt had this to say: "The characters are silly and static. They don't develop. Nothing happens. Nothing means anything. There is a denial of all meaning, of all possibility of meaning, in his nihilistic ending. The defects don't matter, though. The book will do well. The critics won't be able to hurt his sales much, even though they'd like to. Kurt's readers will buy the book. He doesn't suppose they're very good readers anyway, which is why he writes the books as he does." Kurt, before breaking off the friendship, tried to get in contact with Slavitt, who eventually responded back to Kurt with this: "You have willfully blurred the distinction most of us keep between our work and our lives, having put yourself into your work and having made yourself into a literary subject. You have a right to do this, or anything else you want. But there are risks that go along with such practice. Kurt, throughout his life, struggled with depression. In 1984, he tried to take his own. He survived and published Galapagos, which is his most optimistic work. It unfortunately also had unremarkable reviews. Following year, Jane, his ex-wife, died of ovarian cancer. The year after that, he released Bluebeard, which is a meditation of sorts on basically his art and art's place in life. And you can imagine, with the trajectory that I've already laid out, 3 years later, after Bluebeard was published, his own cynicism took new heights, ever growing. His eyes were on the prize. He was taking on America's imperialism, the nature of his own country. He attacked the cultural fragmentation at the very core of America. The novel, of course, is Hocus Pocus. He was running out of ideas for fiction. He didn't know what to write. He still wanted to write nonfiction and more autobiographical things, and he just struggled to do that and couldn't make sense of anything. Of course, this is how we got Timequake in 1997. Timequake is an episodic book with autobiographical fragments, and upon publication, he announced it would be his last novel because he was fresh out of ideas. He was tired. Critics agreed that it should also be his last. I shouldn't laugh at this, but I am. However, with the turn of the century, after a couple of years, he published a new piece of writing, A Man Without a Country. When asked why he returned to writing, he said, "Well, I had hoped to be dead." Apparently, he was actually working on another novel, according to And So It Goes, and that novel would have been called If God Were Alive Today. Fortunately, he passed away April 11th, 2007. So what can we say about who this man is? In many ways, he was very complicated. A desire to grab attention and keep it, at the same time putting on a facade. Near the end of his life, he had a brief stint, again as a writer in residence at a college. Upon finding out that the library did not hold all the collected works of his writing, he was irate, felt disrespected, and tried to donate his own without doing the proper paperwork. Also, in his nonfiction, he once wrote, "Perhaps you have read the novel Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, one of the few masterpieces in the field of science fiction. All the others were written by me." That was in the essay, The Sexual Revolution. At the same time, though, he was full of compassion, having raised his sister's sons after the death of their parents. With all of that said, let me know if you think there's anything that I left out. I will put as much information as I can find to explain the context of these stories. Next week, I will be coming at you with Play a Piano. Thank you.